Let's talk about how to express to be afraid. One of the things that I mentioned earlier is that many expressions can be built out from tener. And a good example of this is expressing something like I am afraid. Now, in Spanish, I'm afraid would be tengo miedo. And it literally means more like I have fear. So, where in English we say I am afraid, in Spanish, they would express it as I have fear. So they use tengo for I have, and then this key word here is going to be miedo. So we have mi, do, miedo, miedo. So once again, how would you express I'm afraid? Tengo miedo. Now, see if you can figure out how you would say you're afraid. Tienes miedo. Literally, you have fear. Tienes miedo. How would you ask, are you afraid? Tienes miedo? How would you say he's afraid? Tiene miedo. We're afraid. Tenemos miedo. They're afraid. Tienen miedo. So here we're all working with the present tense, where we have tengo, tienes, tiene, tenemos, and tienen. Let's jump into the future now. How do you think you would say, I'm going to be afraid? Voy a tener miedo. Some of you probably got caught out by that. So let's just break it down. We're using a handle here for the future, voy a, I'm going to. Now, in English, we say I'm going to be afraid. But remember, in Spanish, they say I'm going to have fear. So the to have is tener and miedo, fear. So I'm going to be afraid would be voy a tener miedo. We're using the full verb here, tener, because we have a handle, voy a tener miedo. Now try to say you're going to be afraid. Vas a tener miedo. He's going to be afraid. Va a tener miedo. We're going to be afraid. Vamos a tener miedo. They're going to be afraid. Van a tener miedo. Let's jump into the past now. So what we're expressing is I was afraid, and we just use the line past because again this is was. I was afraid is the line past. So how do you think you would say that? I was afraid. Tenía miedo. As we know, the line past with tener is tenía. So again, we use that simply with miedo at the end. So I was afraid would be tenía miedo. To express of the storm would be de la tormenta. So de is of, and then we have la tormenta for the storm. You can see it's a feminine word ending in a, so we have la. So of the storm would be de la tormenta. How would you say I was afraid of the storm? Tenía miedo de la tormenta. How would you say you were afraid? Tenías miedo. He, she, or it was afraid. Tenía miedo. We were afraid. Teníamos miedo. They were afraid. Tenían miedo. So by default, again, we use the line past unless it's specifically a dot in the past. For example, let's have a look at when it would clearly be a dot in the past. What about if we were saying, I was afraid when he told me the truth? Here's a dot because we're talking about in that moment. At that point in time, when he told me the truth, dot, right? I was afraid. So here's a good example of where we would have to switch out of the line past. Try to say that now. Remember, we're using the dot past. I was afraid when he told me the truth. Tuve miedo cuando me dijo la verdad. Here we have the dot past. Tuve miedo when he told me, cuando me dijo the truth, la verdad. Now, usually we use the line past for everything, but here we have a very specific example of a dot in the past, a moment in time. So we would use that kind of tuve, that dot past in those circumstances. But normally, luckily, we almost always will fall into the line past in most situations in everyday conversation. So let's look at that finally all on one slide now. We would have tenía miedo for I was afraid. Tenías miedo, you were afraid. Tenía miedo for he, she, or it was afraid. Teníamos miedo for we were afraid. And tienen miedo for they were afraid. This is a great example of how we use tener as a verb to say a very common phrase in Spanish. And there are other ones that we will go through in the same way as this. This is just our first example of how we can maximize and get the maximum amount of value out of knowing the verb tener.